As this video will focus on the great British Romantic poet John Keats, I thought I would move my camera outside into nature. Rather than give you a generic overview of Keats's poetry, I would like to focus on a single sonnet that Keats wrote, one of my favorites. It's called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Now, Keats did know some Greek, and he had stumbled his way through the Iliad and the Odyssey at school. But when he read it in Chapman's very fluid, fast-moving translation, it seems to be one of the first times he fully experienced it. It seems like he almost read it in one sitting. Well, in order to capture the impact of encountering Homer so directly, Keats wrote this sonnet. I would like to first recite it to you dramatically and then break it down. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western isles have I been, that bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman sing out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher in the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak at Darien. Now, although many British poets would write Shakespearean sonnets in imitation of William Shakespeare, many of them, especially Keats, enjoyed writing what was called a Petrarchan sonnet, going back to the great Italian poet Petrarch. In a Shakespearean sonnet, we have four parts. We have 3 4-line quatrains followed by a couplet. But in a Petrarchan sonnet, like the one you just heard, there's really only 2 sections. There's an octave composed of 8 lines and a sestet composed of 6 lines. And when you have a poem that breaks like that into 2 almost equal halves, you have to figure out how you're going to use that structure. Some poets will ask a question in the octave and then give the answer in the sestet. Some will pose a problem in the octave and then offer a solution in the sestet. Some might move from a historical event to the impact of the event. Some might study something in the abstract and then look at it personally. What Keats does in this poem, in the first 8 lines, he registers hot off the presses exactly the way he felt. Then in the sestet, the last 6 lines, he steps back and tries to find just the right simile to explain what the experience was like. In the octave, he creates what I think is a beautiful metaphor for poetry. He imagines perhaps the Mediterranean Sea filled with islands, and each of those islands is one of the major poets. So there is a Homer Island, a Virgil Island, a Dante Island, a Wordsworth Island, a Milton Island, a Tennyson Island, and maybe even a Keats Island. And he had never quite visited the island of Homer till he read it in Chapman's translation, and then suddenly it hit him with all the power of a revelation. I mean, he'd known from reading critics how great Homer was, but he never really knew along his viscera, along his veins and his nerves, he never knew what it was like until he sailed around that island. And it's rather interesting because he acts as if Apollo, the Greek god of poetry, is sort of the lord in a sort of feudal society, and each of the great poets pays homage to Apollo as their lord, as their, you might call it their great king, or their holy Roman emperor, if you know a little bit about the Middle Ages. And by going there, Keats pays homage not only to Homer, but to Apollo, the great bard who oversees poetry. Now in the sestet, he gets a little more specific. Now he wants to find a simile, and he actually gives us 2, both of them starting with the word like. He says first that he feels like an astrologer looking, or I should say an astronomer, looking through his telescope and seeing a planet for the first time that no one had ever seen before. A kind of discovery of something that had always been there, but no one had ever seen it quite in its fullness. And then he describes it with one of the most famous historical errors in all of British literature. He talks about when Cortes, although it was really Balboa, first got to Panama, sort of where the Panama Canal is today, and from a peak he saw for the first time the Pacific Ocean. And it was a moment of great discovery. Again, something that was always there, but you didn't realize it until you stood on that mountaintop and took it in, breathed it in. Now, I love the way he describes it. He speaks of Cortes, Balboa really, Cortes's men having this wild surmise on their face and yet being silent. Have you ever been to a church that has a crying room? If you look in the back, there'll be a little room that's shielded with a thick glass. And that's where the babies go, because if they scream, nobody will be able to hear it. Well, if you've ever turned around and looked at the babies, this is what you'll see. These screaming children, but you can't hear them. It's almost like emotion that is frozen. And that's sort of the way that Keats feels whenever he comes to the presence of great art, like the Grecian urn, or even when he comes into the presence of something transcendent, ethereal, not of this world, like when he first hears the song of the nightingale in his famous Ode to the Nightingale. And when Keats the poet experiences something like that, it catapults him into what I like to call a sort of state or mood of process in stasis. Now that's really an oxymoron. Either you're moving or you're still. But for Keats, great art and great beauty takes us into a world where everything is still, because it's perfect, but everything is also moving and growing and developing. For Keats, that was his image of heaven, something that was perfect and yet repeated again and again. As you read Keats's poems, look for Keats, the poet who wants to register the experience of coming into a mood of process in stasis.